Hello, everybody, and welcome to Fair Housing, what you need to know about housing discrimination. My name is Julia, and I am the program manager for the Office of Off-Campus Living. And with me today are also our peer educators in the Office of Off-Campus Living who are here to help you with any questions or needs that you have to do with moving off campus, living off campus, conflicts with roommates, rental issues, conflicts with landlords, or basically anything you need to know about adulting. So I'll let them introduce themselves right now.
Hi, I'm Kendra.
Hi, I'm Jerry Frunk.
Hi, I'm Ethan.
And I'm Han.
Great, thanks everybody. So this event is part of Home Month, which stands for Helping Out with Moving Essentials. It'll be going through the first week in March, and we will still, after this event, we'll be having another event about leases, deposits, and working with your landlord to start your renting process. And then we'll also have something about being a good neighbor and adulting in our neighborhood. So we'll have information for you about how to do your garbage, rules about parking, getting to know the noise ordinance in Bellingham in case you want to have some friends over once COVID's done, and things like that. And then our final event will be, actually we'll have two more events. Our big event will be the housing fair, which will be March 4th from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. And you'll have a chance to interact with all sorts of landlords that will have virtual booths that you can send them chats. They'll be setting up Teams meetings or Zoom meetings and have videos of their units for you to check out. And then our final event will be one more roommate speed date. So if there's anybody out there who is not found a roommate for next year, it's a really fun event where folks can show up. We'll just put you randomly in different breakout rooms, and you'll have a chance to meet each other and talk and see if maybe you'll be a good fit for roommates. So that's Home Month in a nutshell. And if there's any other questions you ever have about living or moving off campus, you can reach the Office of Off-Campus Living during our Friday office hours, which Ethan leads, and those are from 3 to 5 p.m. We also have a website, which is off-campus living at offcampusliving.ww.edu. And Ethan's going to drop a link to that in the chat. And our email is offcampusliving@ww.edu, which you can also reach us there. And then the final thing that we have to offer is our Discord site. We just basically opened it up to all students living off campus just to have an opportunity to ask us questions, to connect with each other, and we'll often do live events on there or have chats so that people can connect with us. So check out our website. All the information is on there. And with that being said, I'm going to turn this over to our guests, who I'm very grateful to have with us, Lisa Manos and Kate Bartholomew from the city of Bellingham, who are going to talk to us about all the important things we need to know about fair housing and housing discrimination. So thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, really happy. Lisa and I have been doing this event with Julia for several years, and we always look forward to getting to hear from students and talk to students. So sorry that we have to be so far apart and there are no hash browns this time around, but hopefully this will be some good information. So I'll just go ahead and share my screen. I guess I should introduce ourselves a little bit. Both Lisa and I work in the Department of Planning and Community Development at the City of Bellingham, and more specifically, we're in the community development part. So Lisa and I both work with, she does our home rehab program primarily, and I work with a lot of our nonprofit housing partners here in the city. So over to fair housing law. I'll get started by sharing my screen. And everyone see that slide? Yep. Great. All right. And you know, Julia, I did say I can't see the chat function, I don't think, while I'm presenting. So if there are chats, if people have questions as we go along, looks like we're a small group. And it's even, you know, the students who are here as part of their job duties. I hope this is a good learning experience for you because you're great resources for the rest of the student body. So if you have questions or want to respond to my questions, please go ahead and put that in the chat. That would be great. And then someone yell at me and say, hey, we got a question, and I'll stop. All right. So fair housing, what is fair housing? I always like to start here because a few years ago when I started at the city, we did a big fair housing assessment and a survey and a lot of community engagement. And people, it was quite clear, were very confused by the word fair, which is understandable because fair can mean a lot of things. But specifically, the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968 to prevent discrimination in housing. So it's not necessarily about fairness in all the other senses of the word that we think of fairness, like, is it affordable? Can I find housing? You know, like all these other things that may or may not be fair in a more expansive way, but it's really about preventing people from being discriminated against as they were seeking to rent or buy housing. And this was something that has gotten more attention lately, just the legacy that this left in our country and led to a lot of the racial inequities that we see today are because people were overtly and explicitly not allowed to buy or rent high quality housing in desirable neighborhoods because of their race or their gender, the color of their skin, their religion. So I'll go into those categories here just so that we're all on the same page in a minute. But first, I want to fast forward to today and say, what does housing discrimination look like today in Bellingham? It looks quite different than what we saw in the 1960s and leading up to that. Here are some actual quotes or comments that we have seen as Lisa and I have done our work here in the city. And some are from surveys or some are from people who have called or emailed us. And these are some examples of people facing discrimination. So the property owner didn't think a single woman would be able to take care of the lawn. Or the Craigslist ad said, sorry, no housing assistance. Or they didn't want to rent to us because we are not married. Or they said my assistance animal wasn't allowed because of their no pets policy. Or my landlord was furious when she found out that I was going to have a baby. So actually all of these quotes are things that are protected currently under our federal or state fair housing law. So in the United States, everybody is protected from discrimination in housing because of their race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Later on, disability and familial status were also added to this list. So the quote about a landlord being furious because that someone got pregnant and was going to have a baby is a familial status discrimination. Your landlord cannot dictate or in any way discriminate against you because you have children or adopt or maybe you're taking care of a child in your household. Doesn't matter the relationship, it's your familial status. It's really none of their business. And your disability status, which Lisa is going to get into in a lot of detail a little later. In addition, in Washington, we've got some more protected classes. So there's marital status, sexual orientation, gender identity, veteran or military status, and source of income. So that quote on the last slide about they didn't want to rent to us because we're a couple and we're not married, that's actually protected class. Your landlord really doesn't have the right to choose, to say overtly, oh, I don't want to rent to a couple unless they're married, or if you're same sex couple, or if, they ask if are you guys roommates or are you guys a couple? I mean, that's really, the relationship between you and other people in your household is really, again, it's not your landlord's business. It doesn't matter. It doesn't have a bearing on making you a qualified tenant. And then I have source of income here on the bottom in red, because this is actually a really new one. Until I think it was a year or two ago, It was legal for landlords, like in that Craigslist ad, that on the quote from the previous slide, it was legal for landlords to just say, don't even apply if you have housing assistance. And that law has now changed in the whole state of Washington. So if somebody has some kind of assistance, maybe they have a veteran's benefit, or maybe they have Social Security income or a Section 8 voucher. These are all valid sources of income, and they're all valid ways to pay the rent. And so your landlord can't just overtly refuse to rent to somebody because of how they're paying. Again, that doesn't really influence how qualified you are as a tenant, or how good of a renter you're going to be, or how responsible you are. So that's just to get us on the same page about what are we talking about when we talk about fair housing. Another thing that's really confusing for people is there are a lot of laws in completely separate jurisdictions that influence or affect your rights regarding housing. So we have our Washington State landlord tenant law, which I think if you were attended the session, Julia, did David already do his presentation on that one?
He's going to be doing his next Tuesday.
Oh, super. So that's a great one. And that's where a lot of the conflicts between renters and landlords do come up, are under Washington State landlord tenant law. That's things like disputes about getting your deposit back or terminating your lease, etc. Then there's a Federal Fair Housing Act, which I just explained. There's the Americans with Disabilities Act, which can influence housing. And then there's Bellingham's local ordinances, which I'll get to at the very end of this presentation. But anyway, it is confusing for people because these are totally different, levels of government that monitor different types of laws that might have to do with your housing. So just want to make that clear as well. So Lisa is going to take over here and get into some more specific information on disability and reasonable accommodations.
Okay, thank you.
Actually, were there any questions on that first part?
I don't see any.
Cool. All right. Go ahead, Lisa, and I'll just advance for you.
Okay, thank you, Kate. As Kate said, the fair housing law has been around for years and years, and it's changed. Some of the things that are our current interest right now is the number one complaint in fair housing is no longer race. It is now disability, and it's that way in Whatcom County, and it's across the country. Disability is the number one complaint. Federal non-discrimination laws define a person with a disability to include any individuals with a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. Individuals with a record of such impairments, or an individual who is regarded as having such an impediment. So, next slide. If you have a disability, you also have the right to request a reasonable accommodation. The accommodations must be directly related to your disability. The request is reasonable if it doesn't cost the property owner thousands of dollars, but rather a change is needed in the housing provider's rules, policies, practices, or services when the change needed gives people with the disability equal opportunity to use and enjoy their housing. When requested accommodations are reasonable, housing providers are required by law to make the accommodation. Next slide. Examples of reasonable accommodations. I think we're one slide ahead. Examples of reasonable accommodations would be, for instance, assigning an accessible parking space for a person with a mobility impairment, or a tenant with mental disabilities who may be afraid to leave her residence, allow her to pay her rent by mail, even though the housing provider's rules require that the rent must be paid in person at the rental office. or permitting a tenant to transfer to the ground floor, a ground floor unit when it next becomes available because the stairs have become too much for them. And finally, permitting an assistant animal in a no pets building for a person who is deaf, blind, has seizures, or has a mental illness. Next slide. Service animals and assistant animals are for people with disabilities in housing. Persons with the disability may request a reasonable accommodation for any assistance animals, including an emotional support animal. The law does not limit these support animals to just dogs. However, requesting a support cow would probably be a little unreasonable. Service animals are not pets. A service animal may be a reasonable accommodation for someone with a disability, even if there is a no pets policy in the apartment building. Landlords cannot charge you a pet deposit or a pet fee. A service animal is not a pet. A service animal assists someone to deal with the effects of their disability. It can be any type of an animal, and it can be any type of breed. Service animals do not need to have any special license or training or be certified. And the landlord cannot ask you the nature of your disability. There is much confusion when it comes to service animals, especially with landlords, because a lot of people feel like they should not allow them if they're not like a seeing eye dog that's been licensed and registered and wears a vest. Those kind of service animals are ADA service animals, and they're for public spaces, restaurants, shops, traveling on public transportation, etc. Fair housing covers private residents, both rented and privately owned, and it is much less restrictive. I think it's a good idea for everyone, if they have a service animal, to be upfront when they are originally renting the unit, explain what they have the proper documentation for that service animal, and it usually goes much smoother than I've had many calls from people who had a service animal and didn't mention it to the landlord, who later discovered it, and then they were trying to put in all the paperwork for an emotional support animal, and that doesn't work out very well. Kate, one
I just
more.
wanted to add really quick, we have gotten a lot of calls in the past from landlords too, who have discovered an animal in students' housing and then wanted to terminate the lease because there's no pets policy. And then the student or the renter claims that it's a service animal. You know, and there are a lot of websites where you can go online and go get like basically like a doctor's note saying you need a service animal for, you know, for free or for a fee. But just to let you know that also, like, the landlords can Google as well. And those aren't very well, like, good proof of your disability. So lots of people do have service animals for legitimate disabilities, but I just want to emphasize, as Lisa said, you should get that, get a note from a healthcare provider who helps treat you for your disability, and get some sort of documentation that says that this specific animal is related to coping with the effects of your disability, and have that ready and upfront when you apply. So don't get an animal without telling your landlord and then try to say it's a service animal. That doesn't really work out so well. We do get, that's probably the most student related calls that we get, I would say, at the city. Yeah.
That's true. And one last thing regarding that, if you need any information or documents to give to your landlord to educate him on service animals, you can contact me at the city, and it's my phone number's on the screen now, and I can email you a copy of the rules and the paperwork and the request form. So go ahead and let me know and I'll send it to you. So what do you do if you think you've been discriminated against? It's really confusing. As Kate said earlier, there's so many different agencies with all different rules, and there's Fair Housing and the Landlord Tenant Act, and it's hard to know if you've truly been discriminated against. So there's a few things you can do. One, you can contact me, and I have on the screen, my email and my phone number, and I can help get you through it and try to decide whether it's a landlord-tenant issue or if it's a fair housing discrimination, and then what you can do next to file your complaint. Or you can contact the Fair Housing Center of Washington directly at toll-free 844-557-6322. They also have a really good website where you can make the complaint on the website. If you call, be prepared to leave a message about what your complaint is, and then they will get back to you. You can also file a complaint with the Seattle office of HUD, the Fair Housing Division, and the number is on the screen. But if you have a complaint, do make it right away, because you have 1 year to file a fair housing complaint from the time it first originates until it's too late to make that claim with HUD or the Fair Housing Center of Washington. Thank you. Kate, you had more?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. So just to wrap up here, our last 2 slides, I like to take, since we have a few minutes, to clarify what the city can and can't do to help with issues related to rental housing specifically. So we don't investigate fair housing violations at the city because I explained earlier, that's a federal law, but we're really happy to help point you in the right direction if you can't remember or don't know where to start. We also can't investigate or help mediate in Landlord Tenant Act violations. So those are things where people do call with complaints about their landlord not fixing things or not returning their deposit, etc. And it's not that we don't want to be helpful, but again, that's state law. So the city can't really do anything about that. You have to go through the appropriate channels at the state level. Another thing we hear often is people calling and complaining about their rents going up. We actually, as a city, no city in Washington state has the ability to enact any kind of a rent control. So that's a request we get often, but there's actually a prohibition in it in our state law that does not allow any city to enact a rent control. So that if that would have to change at a state level for us to be able to limit how much landlords can charge for rent. And then recently, as I'm sure many of you have heard, there's a state eviction moratorium. So because of COVID, Governor Inslee passed a moratorium that prohibits landlords from evicting, or property management companies from evicting tenants during the COVID pandemic. And that's been extended now several times. But again, if you or someone you know is getting threatened with an eviction and that moratorium is still in effect, you have to contact the Attorney General's office in the state of Washington, because it's a state moratorium. We didn't enact that, and so we don't control the outcome. But what we can do for you, refer you to resources, investigate certain health and safety concerns in your unit. I can answer questions about that if there's questions. We do spend a considerable amount of time educating landlords and property managers about these laws, so they're aware of what their responsibilities are. And the city has done some work and passed some ordinances to provide some extra protections for renters within city limits. So for example, a couple of years back, we passed an ordinance saying that if a landlord wants to terminate your lease, if your lease is up, or excuse me, and you're on a month-to-month lease, under the state law, you only have to be given 20 days notice to move. And that would be for a no-fault termination, meaning you're paying your rent, you're keeping the place clean, you're following all the rules, you're not causing a problem, but they just decide, you know what, we're gonna rent this out to our our family members, or we just don't want to rent anymore, or we want to sell the house, or whatever the reason is. But it's not because of you. They actually now have to give you a 60-day notice, so 2-month notice to terminate your lease, whereas it used to be 20. And the same thing applies for increasing rent over 10%. So there is some protections there. If a landlord does, if you're on a month-to-month lease and you're paying a certain amount, and then they say, oh, actually next month rent's going to go up by $150. Well, if that's over 10% of what you're paying now, that's actually not allowed in Bellingham. They have to give you 60 days so that you have a little bit more time to decide if you want to continue, or if you want to and pay that amount, or if you want to try and find other housing. So those are some things the city has done, but we realize it's not as much as some people would like, but we're trying where we can. So that's the end. I think we can open it up if there are any questions.
Kate, I just wanted to jump in really quickly and let folks know too, if they do have questions about any of those things that you mentioned on either of those slides, the Office of Off-Campus Living up at Western can also help direct you to resources. So if you can't remember Kate's name or Lisa's name, feel free to give Off-Campus Living a call or an email, and we can get you to the right place too.
Yep. Okay.
Anybody out there have any questions, comments? Want to just chat with us?
Did anyone find this information surprising?
Lisa just told me she got a call today. Some people are surprised that I meant to call this out, but being a student is not a protected class. So some folks do say in their ads or their whatever, no students in their house posting. And actually that is allowed under fair housing law. You can just blanket say you're not going to rent to students because they're not a protected class. So again, that's where that like definition of fair really comes in. We that doesn't seem fair to a lot of folks, and that's totally understandable, but it is technically allowed under the fair housing laws that we have today.
Kate, if they were to say no student loans or nobody under the age of 25, those would be protected.
Not exactly. Yes and no. So yes, for the payment, because source of income is protected. So no matter if you're going to pay with student loans or a scholarship or whatever, grant funds, that's protected because that's your source of income. They can't discriminate against you because of that. I didn't have it on the slide, but in the city of Bellingham, we do have, I think maybe I did, age is on there, but it's actually those over 60 or something like that. So it only applies to folks in their upper years, not their lower years. So you can discriminate against folks who are younger, but not because of they can't say, I don't want to rent to somebody who's in their more senior years. That's the way that's written.
And another way to look at that is places that just say, we only want older people, unless they have a specific set of requirements that are met to follow those.
Yeah. Karina, did you have a question?
Hi, yeah, I was just wondering, I've heard about a certain amount of time that a landlord has to give their tenant notice if they are to like show up at their house or like do a check-in or something. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, so that is under the state Landlord Tenant Act. It's not a fair housing thing, but that does come up a lot. And do you know off the top of your head, Julia, is it 48 hours?
I think it's 24 for repairs and 48 for showing the place.
Or even coming in. Yeah. Yeah. So that does come up a lot, and I know a lot of people have experienced landlords just kind of popping by and wanting access to your unit, and that's not okay. It's your home, and you have a right to be kind of notified. You don't have to give permission, though. That does come up sometimes where there's a confusion between the tenant and the landlord. You don't have to say, yes, you can come in, at that time, but they do have to let you know within 48 hours, unless Julia said for a repair, 24 hours, that they are coming. So you can expect them. So they don't just show up and surprise you.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have found in Googling Washington State landlord tenant law, it's really nicely set up, and there's a table of contents. You can search for what your question is, and oftentimes just answer your own question by going there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think a lot of times landlords might, especially if they're have been landlords for a long time, may not know that some of these laws exist, and oftentimes just pointing them out helps your landlord change their behavior instead of making a threat like, I'm going to make a complaint or whatever, that's against the law. Usually just saying like, did you know that actually you have to give me 48 hours before you come pop by my apartment, and like, here's the link, and same thing, like I've had renters call who they wanted to terminate a lease without the 60-day notice, and we just say, hey, did you know that actually in Bellingham you have to give 60 days? You can't give less than 60 days, unless there's a violation of the lease. So you just send them that info, and usually if people know it's a law, they will want to comply. You don't have to necessarily threaten to sue them.
I would also recommend, there's a website called Washington Law Help, and they have all sorts of videos and rules broken down into like very understandable language. So I always find that helpful.
Good.
Great.
Cool. Well, is there any other questions out there? Okay, well, thanks again, Lisa and Kate, for coming, and we will be posting this video up on our home month website. So if there are questions or something that you forgot, you can always just go back to this video and get all the information you need. So
thank you. It's nice to see you all again.
Thank you.
You too. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.